They say nothing prepares you for the moment someone looks at you differently, not with words, but with eyes that see through the surface. What happens when someone notices you in a way that shakes your entire reality? I wasn't prepared for that look. They say nothing prepares you for the moment someone looks at you differently, not with words, but with eyes that see straight through the surface. I thought I was simply being a gracious host, playing the role I'd perfected over the years. It was just an evening meal, just a polite dinner with my husband's supervisor. But what unfolded that night stirred something dormant within me. Not guilt, not shame, but a quiet, unsettling awareness of my own existence. My name is Linda, and I'm 52 years old. I've been married to Richard for 27 years. If I had to capture our marriage in a single word, it would be stable. Not passionate, not romantic in a candlelit sense, but solid and predictable. There's comfort in that, especially at this stage of life. You establish patterns. You grow accustomed to silence. You stop questioning the shape your days have taken. That Friday morning, Richard asked almost casually if we could have his new supervisor over for dinner. His name's Thomas, Richard said while adjusting his tie in the mirror. Unmarried, mid-50s, recently relocated here. Thought it might be nice to show him some local warmth, I agreed. Of course, why not? What does he enjoy eating? Not particular, I believe. Seems quiet, well-mannered. I think you'll get along. That evening, I brought out the fine linen napkins I typically reserve for holidays. I'm not certain why. Perhaps boredom, or maybe some part of me needed to feel engaged, noticed. I prepared herb-crusted salmon with citrus butter, roasted vegetables, and an arugula salad with goat cheese. The kind of meal that says, I'm accomplished in the kitchen without being pretentious. When Thomas arrived, I was still finishing preparations. Richard welcomed him inside, and I heard the door close, followed by low, masculine voices exchanging pleasantries. I emerged from the kitchen, wiping my hands on a towel, expecting someone older, perhaps balding, with a weary expression. But Thomas wasn't what I'd imagined at all. He stood several inches taller than Richard, with deliberately styled salt and pepper hair that looked intentional rather than accidental. Broad shoulders, a defined jawline, and eyes that met mine with quiet intensity. He wore a navy dress shirt with sleeves rolled precisely to reveal strong forearms, the kind of man you'd assume had someone sophisticated waiting for him at home. Thomas, this is my wife, Linda. He stepped forward and extended his hand. A pleasure to meet you. His handshake was firm, his palm warm, his eyes held mine just a fraction longer than necessary. I smiled politely. Dinner will be ready shortly. Please make yourself at home. We sat down soon after. The conversation flowed easily, mostly Richard discussing work. Thomas occasionally added dry, perfectly timed observations that made me laugh more than I anticipated. It wasn't flirtation, not exactly. It was something more subtle. A tension that hummed beneath the surface, a pause before speaking. A glance held for just a breath too long. I noticed he barely touched his wine glass, but watched me carefully each time I reached for mine. He asked about the house, the neighborhood, how long we'd been here. Standard conversation, yet it felt purposeful, as though he was listening for something deeper in my responses. Later, Richard excused himself to take a work call in the study. I began clearing plates, and Thomas offered assistance. I declined, but he stood anyway, following me into the kitchen and leaning against the counter as I loaded the dishwasher. You're an exceptional cook, he said. I haven't enjoyed a meal like that in quite some time. Thank you, I replied, not looking at him. I could feel his gaze on my back. You make it appear effortless, managing everything. It's remarkable. I turned around then, half laughing. It's just dinner. Nothing extraordinary. That's where you're mistaken. Our eyes met. For a moment, the kitchen fell silent. No clinking dishes, no refrigerator hum, just stillness, that unspoken understanding. He wasn't talking about the food or the evening. He was talking about me. And perhaps foolishly, I didn't look away. Richard's fortunate, he added softly. But there was something in his voice, a note of something restrained. Admiration mixed with regret. I broke the gaze first. He knows, I said almost reflexively. But truthfully, I wasn't certain Richard did any more. Not really. Not the way he once had. Thomas nodded once, then stepped back. Thank you again, Linda, for everything. I walked him to the door, and Richard returned just in time for goodbyes. The two men shook hands, exchanged brief parting words, and then Thomas stepped out into the night, the porch light casting long shadows behind him. Richard closed the door. "Pleasant fellow, isn't he?" "Very," I replied, my voice calm, my hands folded, but inside me something had shifted. It wasn't attraction, not in the conventional sense. It was recognition. Thomas had seen something in me that I hadn't felt in years. Maybe since before the children, before the routines, before I stopped wondering if anyone still noticed. That night, as Richard slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling for hours. The memory of Thomas's gaze lingered. Not invasive, not inappropriate, just awake, present. A reminder of who I used to be, of who I might still be. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the peaceful way I usually found comforting. It was the kind of quiet that fills your mind with persistent thoughts, like an echo you can't silence. I went through my routines, morning coffee, tidying up, evening walks, but I couldn't shake the way Thomas had looked at me. It wasn't fantasy or obsession, but it was present, persistent. Richard didn't mention him again, not even in passing, and I didn't ask. I told myself that meant nothing, that it was simply dinner, that Thomas had probably forgotten the entire evening, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. About a week later, I went to the specialty market 2 neighborhoods over. I liked it because it wasn't crowded, and the produce always looked carefully curated. I had just selected a bunch of fresh basil when someone behind me said, "That's the perfect choice for late summer. Excellent, with lemon pasta." I turned around, and there he was, Thomas, dressed in jeans and a charcoal polo, a shopping basket casually hooked over his arm, smiling as though we were old acquaintances who happened to cross paths regularly. I felt my pulse quicken. "Hello," I said too quietly, then cleared my throat. "Good to see you." "Likewise," he said, his tone even but warm. "Didn't expect to run into you here. I come for the tomatoes. The ones at our regular store are always disappointing." "Excellent taste, clearly." He glanced down at his basket. "I'm attempting to relearn how to cook." "Long overdue," I smiled, unsure how to respond. There was a pause. Not awkward, just full. "I've thought about that dinner several times," he said finally. "Not just the food, the way you create atmosphere. You have a grounding presence." That word, grounding, it struck me in an unexpected way. I'd always thought of myself as dependable, stable, but the way he said it made it sound desirable, like something worth noticing. I glanced away, pretending to examine a display of lemons. "That's kind of you to say." "It's not kindness," he said. "It's simply true." We stood there a moment too long. I could feel it again. Perhaps if Richard's ever occupied and you feel like sharing more of that lemon pasta, I'd be honored. I didn't answer. I just gave a polite nod and turned away, heart racing in my chest. I could feel his eyes following me as I walked down the aisle. Not leering, not disrespectful, just aware. That night, I didn't tell Richard I'd encountered Thomas, not out of guilt, but because I knew he wouldn't hear what I wasn't saying. He'd simply nod, maybe ask what Thomas was purchasing, and move on to discussing the weather or gas prices, and I wanted someone to truly hear me. A few days later, Richard had to travel for a conference. He used to ask if I wanted to join him, make it a small getaway, but somewhere along the years, we'd both stopped offering those gestures. Now, it was simply routine. "You'll be fine without me for 2 nights?" he asked, only half checking. "Of course," I said. "It'll be nice to have the house to myself." He kissed my cheek, wheeled his compact suitcase to the car, and departed. By late afternoon, the house felt too quiet, not peaceful, but hollow. I put on some soft jazz, poured myself wine, and started preparing that lemon pasta I'd mentioned at the market. Halfway through, I paused. I stared at the basil leaves, the lemon zest, the empty second plate beside the stove. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I picked up my phone. I didn't text him. That would have felt like too much, but I scrolled through contacts, found his name that Richard had once given me to coordinate that dinner, and stared at it. My finger hovered. Then I called. He answered on the second ring. "Linda," he said, calm but curious. "I made the pasta," I said. "Too much for one person." There was a pause. "Would it be appropriate if I stopped by?" he asked, his voice low. I exhaled slowly. "Yes, When I opened the door 20 minutes later, he stood there with a bottle of wine and something gentle in his expression. He didn't try to kiss me. He didn't rush inside. It simply waited. I stepped aside and let him in. And in that moment, I knew something had already changed. Not because of what would happen that night, but because of what already had. Something had awakened. Not recklessness or disloyalty, just the simple aching need to be seen again. Not as a wife, not as a role, but as a woman. Dinner was quiet at first. Thomas sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where I'd hosted him with Richard. But this time the space felt more intimate, like the air between us had thickened. The only light came from the small counter lamp, and the candle I'd lit without thinking, perhaps out of habit or nervous energy. The jazz continued playing softly, filling silences without demanding attention. He twirled pasta on his fork and said, "You weren't exaggerating. This is incredible." I smiled, trying to stay grounded. "It's just lemon, garlic, basil, and cream." He looked up. "Don't diminish it. We ate in the kind of silence that feels complete rather than awkward." His presence wasn't overwhelming. In fact, it was oddly comforting. He didn't ask intrusive questions. He didn't allude to anything beyond the meal. But every time our eyes met, I felt that soft pull again, like gravity but gentler. After we finished, I stood to clear dishes. He rose to help, and this time, I didn't object. We moved around the kitchen in quiet rhythm, hands brushing once, maybe twice more than necessary. At one point, he turned to hand me a plate, and I noticed how close he'd gotten. "Linda," he said, voice just above a whisper. I looked up. There was stillness, the kind that precedes a choice, but he didn't reach for me. He didn't step closer. He just looked at me, steady and open. "I don't want to complicate things," he said. "They already are," I replied. He nodded slowly, understanding something in my voice I hadn't meant to reveal. "I'm not unhappy," I continued almost defensively. "Richard's been good to me. Our life is stable." Thomas remained quiet, his eyes kind. "But there are days," I said, my voice trailing off. "Days when I feel like I don't quite exist. Not fully, like I'm part of the scenery, but not really noticed. Do you understand?" He stepped back slightly then, giving me space. Not because he was retreating, but because he was listening. "I do," he said softly. "I know that feeling better than I should. We didn't touch, we didn't even move. We just stood there, two people who had collided at the precise moment they were both silently unraveling." I poured us each another glass of wine, and we moved to the living room. We sat side by side on the couch, not touching, but close enough to share the same breath. He noticed the photograph of Richard and me on the side table. A much younger version of us on a beach, smiling, arms wrapped around each other. "You both look happy," he said. "We were," I replied. "Still are in a way. It's just different now." He didn't press, just took a slow sip of his wine. I looked at him and asked, "Why did you come tonight?" "Why did you come tonight?" "You met my eyes. Because I wanted to see you, not for anything else, just to see you again. That admission did something to me. It broke open a part I'd been holding together with threads of obligation and habit." I leaned back against the couch, closed my eyes for a moment, and let the stillness settle between us. I could feel him beside me, not moving, not assuming, just being there. And that was more intimate than any touch. He didn't stay late. When he stood to leave, I walked him to the door again. But this time there was no Richard to interrupt. Just the sound of crickets outside and the low hum of night. He turned to face me. I meant what I said. "You don't have to explain yourself to anyone, not even me. But if you ever need someone to talk to, someone to truly listen, I'm here." I didn't respond immediately. I just nodded slowly as though giving myself permission to believe him. Then, without hesitation, he reached out. Not for a kiss, not for anything expected, but to gently brush a strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered near my cheek for the briefest moment. Then he stepped back. "Good night, Linda." And just like that, he was gone again. I closed the door, leaning my back against it as I exhaled. Everything about the evening had been quiet, controlled, respectful. But my body hummed with the feeling of being awake in a way I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't about temptation. It wasn't even about romance. It was about being seen. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, and for once, it didn't feel like routine. It felt like a decision. I made my coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out at the small garden Richard and I had planted years ago. The basil was still there, overgrown, but holding on. Kind of like me, I didn't know where things were heading. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew this. Something had changed. And it wasn't Thomas. It was me. Richard returned Sunday evening just before dusk, wheeling his suitcase through the front door with that familiar sound echoing through the quiet house. I was in the kitchen folding dish towels, not out of necessity, but because my hands needed occupation. He smiled when he saw me, came over, kissed my forehead, and asked, "Miss me?" I smiled back. Of course, and I meant it in my own way. I had missed him. His steadiness, his dry humor, the way he always checked if the porch light was on before bed. But at the same time, something in me felt distant, like I was standing just a little further back from the version of myself he was accustomed to. We ate leftovers that night, and I listened to him recap the conference, the meetings, the amusing incident involving someone spilling coffee on equipment. I laughed at appropriate moments, asked the right questions, but I wasn't fully present. Not because I wasn't interested, but because part of me had changed shape. I wasn't sure he could see it. I wasn't sure I wanted him to. Later, lying in bed beside him, I stared up at the ceiling again, just as I had the night Thomas left. But now, it wasn't confusion or guilt keeping me awake. It was clarity. The next morning, as Richard left for work, I handed him his lunch as always, kissed him on the cheek, and watched him drive away. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after, hands wrapped around a warm mug, staring at the garden. Then I picked up my phone and texted Thomas. "Thank you for the other night, for listening. I don't know what this is, or if it's anything at all, but I needed that." He replied minutes later. "You've never stopped existing. You just needed someone to remind you." And that was it. Nothing romantic, nothing inappropriate, just two people recognizing something true in each other. I didn't see him again for weeks, but his words stayed with me. The following month, I joined a local writing group. I'd always wanted to try it. Richard used to joke that I had stories for days with nowhere to put them. I began journaling again, too, every morning. At first, just scribbles, thoughts, fragments of emotion. But then it grew into something fuller. Essays, stories, memories I hadn't touched in years. I also started dressing differently. Not provocatively, just with intention. Colors that felt bold, jewelry I hadn't worn in ages, lipstick I'd forgotten I owned. Richard noticed eventually. "You look different," he said one evening as we prepared to meet friends for dinner. "Do I?" I replied, turning to the mirror and adjusting a gold earring. He looked at me for a beat longer than usual. "You look good."